Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our second in our virtual summer workshop series. My name is Kimberly Bolero, and I'm the director of the Holocaust Education Resource and Outreach Center, or the Hero Center at Voices of Hope in Connecticut. I know we have a number of, I think we have some teachers joining us from out of state. So if you're in Connecticut or if you're out of state, send us a quick note through the chat. Tell us which town or which state you're joining us from. We would love to see who is here. The workshop series was created through the Holocaust and Genocide Education Advisory Committee, which was created to help educators in Connecticut implement state legislation passed in 2018. Normally, we would be holding these workshops at various institutions around the state, but we are thrilled to be able to work with you all remotely today. Before we start, I want to do a really quick survey, just a couple of questions. It is anonymous, but they're very simple questions. So have you taught the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi in your classroom before? Have you taught rescue during the genocide against the Tutsi before? This is just so we can get an idea of if we are working with anyone who is completely new to the topic of the genocide itself or rescue in general. Okay, so it looks like we are 50-50 for everything. So that's great. We have a mix of new and not so new. So thank you for that. Let's see. So thank you so much. Let's get started with that. We will keep everyone muted at this point. But if you have questions or comments throughout each of the presentations today, please feel free to send them through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. We encourage everyone to share their experiences, ideas, challenges, and the like, as this will really only help us better teach the topic of rescue. I'm very happy to introduce Dr. David Simon of Yale University, Stu Abrams of Avon High School, and Colleen Simon of Solomon Schechter Day School. No relation between the Simons today.
That we know of.
That we know of. Each of our presenters is a member of the advisory committee, and they are all incredible resources when it comes to content and pedagogy for teaching the Holocaust and genocide in the classroom. So with that, I will let David take it away, and we'll get started.
Great. Thank you, Kimberly, and thanks to the Hero Center for pulling this together and creating this. I think it's really important, and I'm delighted to be taking part. I feel bad, I only put my name on the slide that you see in front of you because this was just going to be my portion of the show, of the presentations, but this is definitely the three of us working together. We conceptualized this, I think, sort of together, thinking about rescue in part in keeping with the Hero Center's series on rescue for this summer. We thought about, well, what's the story of rescue in Rwanda? And Stu and Colleen and I all know that it's really complicated. It's not straightforward, and it's also, I thought it would be interesting to start with Hotel Rwanda, simply because that, in a way, is a story of rescue. It's the point of entree for many people about the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, and yet it's problematic. So I think what collectively we hope to do is move beyond that as a sort of model for talking about rescue in Rwanda. But I think it's important to start there nonetheless. Let's see, oh dear. Just when I thought I had everything, there we go. I was the one who was joking about no technical glitches, and then I couldn't advance my slide. So let me actually take one step back and begin with a few words about rescue itself. Rescue is a sort of iconic story in any mass violence, and especially genocide. For many people, I think there's a generation who were you to ask them, well, where did you learn about the Holocaust, or what did you learn most about where did you learn the most about the Holocaust? They might say Schindler's List. This a story of rescue. It's accessible. It is inspiring. Genocide and the Holocaust are depressing subjects, and you can sort of paint a I don't know, rosier picture, but make people not feel quite so awful if you can talk about rescue. But when you do that, it is important to recognize that rescue in these instances is almost always an exception. The reason why we study Rwanda and the Holocaust and Cambodia is really the failure of rescue. All the people who weren't rescued, the massive the death tolls, the destruction of societies, of cultures, of peoples. That's the failure of rescue. And so it's a little bit difficult to kind of balance these needs, the need to recognize the humanness within these stories. I think that's a very important thing to be doing, that when you talk of 1 million people dying or 6 million people dying or any large number like that, it actually becomes a little bit dehumanizing. It's just a number. And rescue often forces you to look at, or enables you to look at individual stories and humanize that. And so that we need that, but we have to balance that with the realism that most people weren't rescued, or in many, many cases, the number not rescued vastly exceeds those who were. And Rwanda is no exception to this. So the story of Hotel Rwanda is one of these sort of iconic representations of rescue. Again, for all the reasons that I just mentioned, just applied to Rwanda, it's this story of a man who seemingly risked his life, this is Paul Rusesabagina, to shelter refugees or internally displaced people, more specifically, at the Hotel Colleen, known colloquially now as Hotel Rwanda, in the center of Kigali in 1994. The film itself is very artfully done, I think, in that the first time I saw it, I thought, wow, it's like it has footnotes. Like every scene, every line could be footnoted with some bit of literature that I was familiar with. That little scenes represented talking points for much larger stories. And so, as a representation of the genocide as a whole and the failure of the international response and the relations within Rwanda, all of that is fairly accurate. Problematically, though, including the part that there were over 1,000 people saved, 1,000 people who otherwise would have been killed, took shelter in Hotel Colleen, and they survived. There were some who didn't survive within that context, who took those actions and did not survive, but a very large number of people who were specifically targeted for death did survive. But the controversy arises in that the movie, being Hollywood, chooses to, coming out of Hollywood, chooses to focus on one man, as the previews always say, and that one man, Paul Rusesabagina, is kind of a problematic character. He, in real life, he's been criticized, and the government of Rwanda at this point does not like the movie Hotel Rwanda at all. It's produced several sort of monographs debunking the claims in the movie. But at the core of the complaint is that Rusesabagina was a businessman who forced all his guests to pay money that was then paid to the killers, or passed along to the killers, so that they wouldn't attack on a given day. Meanwhile, Rusesabagina, allegedly was, raiding the hotel bar in part to, sell the alcohol to save his own family and to placate the attackers. When he left the Rwanda, he fled, and he is ethnically a Hutu. He kept company in exile with people who were politically close to the old regime, the genocidal regime, and he harbored ambitions to run for president. All of these things make him, especially in the eyes of the government, a less than ideal hero. And I think in that story, we see a lot of the kind of problematics of rescue that rather than running away from, I think it's important as educators probably to try to embrace. There's a lot we can learn from this, the controversy in Hotel Rwanda. One of it is, and this is maybe a minor point, but just to remember that talking about rescue is political. Again, it's exceptional. So there's always this risk in talking about rescue that you might be minimizing the real tragedy of the events that went on. In the Rwandan context, this rescue narrative runs counter to the narrative of the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the ruling party, the narrative that they try to promote. And it's largely, again, in broad strokes, an accurate narrative, which was that no one was engaged in rescue in Rwanda. The Tutsi in Rwanda were being slaughtered, saving themselves if they could, until the RPF, or RPA really at that point, the Rwandan Patriotic Army, an insurgent group of rebels who had invaded from Uganda in 1990 and were frozen in lines of a peace accord in 1993. They were the ones that reactivated their campaign and drove the architects of the genocide, the executioners, drove them out of the country and seized power from them. And that was the true rescue. So talking about someone like Paul Rusesabagina and Hotel Rwanda sort of takes away from that kind of political founding narrative that the RPF likes to dwell upon. We also learn from the controversy, though, we can think about many of the ways that rescue is complicated. Even if we take Rusesabagina, if we acknowledge that he may be responsible for saving the lives of 1,000 people, we might also, wonder, what was his relationship with the militias? What was his relationship with the government that was supporting the genocide and that he would then hang out with after the fact? I don't want to spread too much conjecture at this point about Rusesabagina personally, but it does point to the fact that I think many people in a genocidal context, if not most, don't fall into the simple categories of perpetrator, survivor, bystander, rescuer, or upstander. Often people were two or more of these categories at the same time. Or as a bit, you can add victim to that as well. Target, I suppose, would encompasses both victim and survivor. Take Theonest Bagosora, who is if there was the baddest of the bad guys in Rwanda, he would probably be the one most responsible for organizing the genocide. At some point, when he realized that the forces were closing in around him, that the UN was talking about a international tribunal, that people were going to be held to account for what was happening, he decided to rescue an orphanage and ship provided a bus to an orphanage that was surrounded. It may even be the same orphanage that Carl Wilkins helped protect. But it was, Theonest Bagosora was the one who made the call and said, no, don't attack there, put them on a bus, send them, I think it was to Burundi. And, part of what he's thinking there is, ties if it is in fact the Wilkins story, it ties very interestingly into a story of, courage and principles. But in this case, the final piece of the puzzle is a guy who's trying to cover up his awful actions. So, in a literal sense, he engaged in an act of rescue. He was also responsible for, probably fair to say, hundreds of thousands of deaths at the same time. I've got a picture of Bagosora there. Generally, at a much less sort of dramatic head of state like or elite level, Rwandans were often faced with extraordinarily cruel choices. They were asked to participate in the genocide, and sometimes they were told that if they didn't, they would be killed. Or what I actually have heard much more often is the story where if they didn't participate, someone that they knew or loved or were protecting would be killed. So they were allowed to rescue someone if that, and that was used as sort of leverage to participate in, to gain their participation in the broader genocidal campaign. So again, in that context, it's like Bagasor, but without the choice. You know, people may have had an inclination to rescue, but they also joined in and undertook reprehensible actions at force of either, you know, physical punishment or losing their ability to rescue when they did that. Let me talk, I don't want to take up too much time. I think I've got about 5 more minutes to talk. So let me talk about 2 sort of realms of rescue that are possible to think about. One is international rescue, and this is broadly an area of failure. The United Nations certainly failed. The United Nations had a force there, UNAMIR, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Rwanda, or for Rwanda rather. Although many of the soldiers within UNAMIR were very brave and you know, risked their own lives, and as we'll talk about Mbe Ndanye here in just a second, as a whole, the United Nations failed. And primarily the failure lies in the hands, the responsibility of those in New York, either in the Secretariat or in the Security Council, they were the ones telling the troops on the ground not to take action, not to intervene, not to engage in rescue, only rescue itself, only rescue the foreigners, and get out of the way. And that's more or less literally what they said and literally what they did. Romeo Dallaire, who was the commander of UNAMIR, who was calling for more troops so that they could do more, basically dragged his feet on these orders, kept about 400 troops on the ground instead of the 100 that the UN was telling them he could keep. And that group did engage in a reasonable amount of rescue. But by and large, the force did a small fraction of what it could have done had it been enabled to. France acted on its own and sent a protection mission called Opération Turquoise, which were essentially peacekeepers that were sent to protect people. But that operation also had the effect of protecting the genocidaires. The RPA was chasing down the authors, the architects of the genocide, the elites, and the French just got in the way and let them escape into what was then called Zaire. Allegedly, many of the French troops didn't even know that it was the Tutsi who needed rescuing. They had believed the propaganda up until that point, until they got boots on the ground, that the Tutsi were persecuting the Hutu and that the Hutu were the ones that needed to be rescued. Finally, there's often internationally the story of NGOs, and they're the first to trumpet their stories of rescue. That's how they make their living and continue their operations, by talking about how they bravely went in and saved people. But in Rwanda, the rescue that the NGOs engaged in were the primarily Hutu refugees who had been ushered out of the country by the genocidal elites. And so by the time the NGOs got on the ground into the camps in eastern Zaire, they were protecting people who were, I guess, best thought of as the cover, the human shields for the genocidal regime, which styled itself as a regime in exile at that point. There were exceptions, though, and perhaps the best known best known exception within this international group worth talking about is Mbe Diagne is how his name's generally pronounced. And what he did, he was a captain in UNAMIR from Senegal, and he engaged in rogue operations of putting people in his truck, bringing them to the UN headquarters, and then on into areas that were protected, like some of the football stadiums in Kigali. He was unarmed. He was armed with a smile and a packet of cigarettes, which he'd share both at the roadblocks where the Hutu militias would be trying to stop people from doing exactly what he was doing, bringing Tutsis across the front lines. In fact, there's an intersection with the Hotel Rwanda story in that he was one of the people who was organized and was driving one of the trucks, actually, that failed to. They had to go back to. They were trying to take a group of kids from Hotel Colleen to the UN headquarters. They were forced to go back and to the hotel and drop the kids off. But he was he was doing that sort of operation all the time. He was killed by shrapnel from an RPF mortar. Perhaps they were targeting the militias. He was at a roadblock. Perhaps they were targeting the militias at that roadblock. Perhaps for some reason he was being targeted directly. But by the time he had killed, it's estimated he had saved hundreds, if not as many as 1,000 Rwandans, basically single-handedly. Finally, let me touch upon local rescue, just briefly. These are the stories that are a little less dramatic, have a harder time, well, they're every bit as dramatic often. They have a harder time reaching international headlines and school curricula, although I think Colleen will have some of them for you shortly. I would say there's at least hundreds of these and probably thousands. Many of them may be tainted or compromised. They're often politically sensitive, especially locally, because the people who engaged in rescue may have been compromised in their actions, or they may also, because they were people who went against the grain, they may have lots of local enemies. So often people locally have every incentive to sort of keep it to themselves. I'll finish with I mentioned in some notes that I think were circulated before this, a study by, I think is it Heather Cox and Holly Bream, where they interviewed 273 known rescuers, just to get some background data on them. And there are three sort of sets of factors that they found set them apart. One was, and this is my awkward phrase, not Cox and Bream's, was their social disembeddedness, which is to say, it's the flip side of the observation that participation in the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda was often very socially embedded. It was because people were tied into their communities and that community leaders said, hey, you have to, you need to be involved in this genocide. You have to participate. By disembeddedness, awkward word, I know, it means that they were able, for some reason, to kind of opt out of those social ties. Some of them, and this is what Cox and Bream focus on, were wealthier than average. So they didn't depend on social ties for standing. They had standing based on their wealth. Others were older. The militia leaders, the local leaders, couldn't ask them to participate in the genocide because they were too old. So there was no leverage over them. And they could engage in rescue without having to participate in the genocide if they could get away with it. There's a second set of factors is experience, or what they called socialization. This is something that I think they were not expecting to find. It makes perfect sense in retrospect. But many of those who engaged in rescue mentioned the fact that their family members had done that in previous episodes in Rwandan history. There were other sort of pogroms against Tutsis in the 70s, a small one in the 80s, in the early 90s before the genocide. And in many times, the family lore was that, oh, you know, the neighbors, they came to our house and we protected them. And they did it again in 1994 because they had been socialized either directly themselves or by sort of the family history. And finally, Cox and Bream note that there are certain institutions that led people to almost systematically engage in rescue. And really at the top of this list of institutions is probably religion. Seventh-day Adventists were very proactive in rescue, as were Jehovah's Witnesses. Both of those religions sort of part of their doctrine, their religious doctrine, is to stay away from political matters, not to get involved in politics. And at a micro level, that's exactly what the genocide against the Tutsi was. It was a political operation. And so it was sort of more natural to Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists and others, you also Muslims as well. But especially for the Seventh-day Adventists and just for the story that I'm telling here, the Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses, they would say, you know, this is a political project. This is a false god in some sense. We're not going to get involved in this the same way we don't get involved in democratic elections. We don't get involved in voting. We don't go to political rallies. We don't get involved in these hunts of members of our society. So that type of mindset, sort of inculcated by religion and other institutions, perhaps, proved to be strong in those instances where rescue did happen. Even in those contexts, of course, remember the way I've set this up, rescue is the exception. I think even in those religious settings, institutions, it may still well have been an exception. I'm going to stop there because in talking about religion, I think that's a nice point at which I can turn it over to Stu, and he will pick up with one specific example of someone who was in Rwanda for essentially religious reasons, with some details of that story about rescue. Stu, it's all yours. And you're muted still. Stu, we can't, there you go.
There you go. And
so Stu, I've got you as
organizing this, and I'd like to thank the law firm of Simon & Simon for pulling me along in terms of getting this together. It was really a joy and a treat working with all of you. I met Carl probably about 10, 12 years ago, and we've become really good friends. And every time, he lives out in the Pacific Northwest, and every time he's on this side of the country, if he's in the neighborhood, which is pretty much anywhere in the Eastern Seaboard, he comes to Connecticut and visits us in Avon. It is really, it's not that often that we actually have the opportunity to meet a true living, breathing hero, as we would, generally define the term hero. He's, for those of us who are teachers, when you have your evaluations, I'm not sure that the manner in which Carl does his presentations would score high marks, but it is enormously effective. He is like a Pied Piper. Students and adults alike are irresistibly attracted to him. And he talks about finding the good in people. Just while I have this one slide up there, I think one of the things that David was talking about, this notion of different groups and in parts of genocides. I think of perpetrators and victims and bystanders and liberators and resistance fighters and rescuers. And I think we often miss out of all of the groups that we might identify. The ones to me that are by far the most important are the rescuers, and probably the least amount of research and the least amount of understanding as to how it is somebody can do that, like Carl, gets there and does that. And if there's anything I want my students to leave with, which I'll talk more about in a little bit, but I want them to understand that being a hero is not wearing a cape, as you well know. It's the ordinary people who do these extraordinary things. And just to pick up on that, in terms of this little beautiful country of Rwanda, how this could have happened there in the manner it did is pretty extraordinary. So what I'd like to do is divide my few minutes into three sections. One is just to give you, for those who are not familiar with Carl, an overview of what he did, and then spend just a minute or two on what he's been doing for the past 26 years. and then share with you some of the things that I've incorporated Carl's story and some of his philosophy into my classes at school, at Avon High School, and seem to have been somewhat effective at times. So in '94, Carl is going to go with his entire family to Rwanda for this event, the ADRA, as he calls it, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency. And as things get bad, he is going to recruit his parents to take his wife and 3 children to Nairobi. And Carl chooses to stay in this, what becomes this maelstrom of death. The US Embassy is very much trying to pressure Carl to leave. And as the title of his book says, I'm not leaving, and he doesn't. And it's the level of courage is almost too much to bear. He is responsible for saving hundreds of lives. He will ultimately become connected with Damas Kasimba, who was running this orphanage and was providing a safe haven for these children. And I'm going to show you a very brief, less than 2-minute video of Carl. And so you can get to meet him. And I think in 2 minutes, you can sort of appreciate the kind of human being he is. So anyway, he meets with Damas, and it becomes a relationship that still exists. And these children are going to be threatened by the Interahamwe, the paramilitary militia group, and it surrounds this orphanage. And I'm not sure, my sense was that it was Kambanda who is the one who sort of saves the orphanage. Although Kambanda was the prime minister, the real power in the government was Bagosora. So it may have gone up the chain of command to Bagosora to make the ultimate decision. And the story in which Carl actually meets Kambanda it's just incredible that Carl actually gets to meet with Kambanda to even make the request. And but sure enough, the planets aligned, and they do get together. I'm just going to play this for you, and hopefully you can see and hear it. If you can, please let me know.
I started to see the militia appearing all around, probably more than 50 of them. They could walk right between the bushes of the enclosure. They could walk in whenever they wanted. And it was after, like I said, 2 to 3 hours that all of a sudden here comes a little double cab Toyota pickup with 7 gendarmes in the back and their little red beret. What a welcome sight these guys were. They pulled in the parking lot. The soldiers jump out of the back of the pickup truck, and they look around and size up the situation. The lieutenant who came with them went with me inside the office, and we tried to explain the situation to him. And I said, is there any way you can spend the night here? Because these guys, it appears, we have a massacre about to happen. And he says, we're just 7. There's nothing we could do here. He says, the best thing is for you to go and talk to my leader. Now, these guys didn't travel with any of their own radios or communication equipment. And so you got some, hard decisions here to make, because can you trust this man? Some of the police were involved in the killing. Some were saving and protecting people. What do you do? But it seemed like the only route to do was to trust him. The young brother said, no, don't go. They're going to kill us as soon as you leave. And I said to him, I promised him. I promised them I'll come back. And so it was with this sick mixture of relief and dread that I got in my car and drove away.
Okay. All right. The story of what Carl goes through when he's in Rwanda, I have to just mention, it is such a profound honor for me to share Carl's story with you. I've never quite met anybody quite like him. This is the image of Carl when he is reunited, obviously, with his family in Nairobi after the time he was there. There was a whole series of audio tapes that he had sent to his wife, Teresa, while he was still in Kigali, and the rest of his family was not. We should all have marriages like this. Since then, he's created this foundation called World Outside My Shoes. The goal is respect, empathy, which will lead to inclusion. And he talks very much about how things need to be reframed, how restorative justice is the way in which Rwanda can begin to heal its wounds. And he has done a tremendous job of sharing and weaving his story and his experience in Rwanda. And he has used this story as a powerful platform. If any of you that are local, when we can actually get back to whatever normal will be, who knows, but if Carl is in the area and if you're interested, perhaps we can arrange for him to come and speak at your school, or you come to ours, or whatever. We can perhaps make that work. He's also very much talks about the elimination of what he calls one thing thinking. People are not necessarily one thing. I think David was addressing this before, how certain people who may have been the architects of the genocide also may have done things that saved lives. It's a very complicated situation. And perhaps the best story I can think of, and I think I included in the bibliography, is the story of Maria and Filbert, and how it is that Filbert, who was responsible for the murder of Maria's family, and how these two people somehow managed to come together. And what's interesting about it is Carl's difficulty in accepting Maria in the way in which she was able to overcome and accept Filbert into her life and into the life of her family that was left, of which there was not many. And I just wanted to end with this really brief overview as to how one might incorporate the story of Carl Wilkins into our classrooms. He talks a lot about trust and how it is he'd rather be disappointed and rather than not trust people at all. The power of social influence, this obedience to authority, the fundamental attribution error, the idea that we tend to overestimate personality and underestimate social influence in determining human behavior. He talks, or you can incorporate his story when you think about the consistency of personality in situations. The idea that we are either good or we're evil. But again, it's not that simple. Rudolf Hess, the commandant at Auschwitz, is a perfect example. During the day, he was one of the most bloodthirsty killers the world has ever created. And then at night, he would go home and be the dutiful husband and be the kind father and be the civilized human being. And yet there was that other side to him. One of the things that I definitely wanted to mention here was the concept of forgiveness. This is a wonderful concept to talk about in classroom, the possibilities and limitations of forgiveness. We used to have a panel discussion in one of our classes. We had people from different religious groups and a lawyer. Odd, I know it sounds like a bad joke. But we would have each one of those talk about the distinctions of the religions relative to forgiveness and the legal understanding of the concept. It is a fascinating topic, and The Sunflower by Simon Wiesenthal is a very interesting and compelling story to look at forgiveness. And the last thing here is, must we become the victims of our own biographies? Who we were in the past doesn't mean necessarily that that is who we need to be. Carl is a wonderful example of this. The marshmallow test, this concept of reframing, we know that the Michelle experiment back in the 60s or 70s, that this experiment that was done to determine whether or not if you can delay gratification, that your whole life seemed to be revolved around this one marshmallow. And Michelle himself doesn't necessarily agree with this, but if you reframe that marshmallow, even little kids were able to delay the gratification. So a lot of this has to do with how we recontextualize, how we use a different schema or a different lens to look at a situation that will change our behavior. And lastly, my favorite question that I use with my students is courage more easily fantasized than realized. Most students, oh yes, of course I would be a hero. Of course I would be well, maybe, but the research wouldn't necessarily bear that out. So I often tell them that they are all, we all are, heroes in waiting, and that we're simply waiting for the opportunity to demonstrate our courage and our heroism. And I promise you, as I promise them, that there will be that moment. Now, hopefully it won't be in a situation as severe as a genocide, but the reality is we all will be in situations where we will have to draw on our ability to be heroic. I often share the story of Wesley Autry, the subway hero in New York, and how he jumped on the tracks and got on top of this guy who was having what might have been a seizure of some kind. The train passes over them, and it's an unbelievable story. And here is just an ordinary one of us doing the most extraordinary thing you might imagine. And here is a picture of Carl and his family. I know this picture is not that recent because Carl's hair is not quite that color anymore, but it's a wonderful family. His wife, Teresa, is terrific. And I'm hopeful that some of you will have some questions, if nothing else, about how else we might incorporate Carl's story into the classroom. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Colleen, if I figure out how to stop sharing. Okay.
Okay, so thank you, and now I have to figure out how to share. Hi, I'm Colleen, and again, thanks to Kim and to Stu and David for including me today, and I'm kind of gonna wrap it up and share with you, looking specifically at female rescuers and women and some of the roles that they had to play and go through in order to rescue. So, sorry, all this awkward waiting, but hopefully it'll be worth it. So I don't know if you can, oh wait, you know what? I hit the wrong, it's hard when you can't see the screen, you know, rescuers. Oh, I hit share instead of present. Oh, okay. So we're going to look at the genocide against the Tutsi and specifically female rescuers. And again, what you'll hear from a lot of rescuers and what Stu was talking about is their humbleness is pretty amazing. And one of the rescuers you'll meet, Josephine Dusabimana, she just said, I just valued each person as a human being. And that's something you'll hear all the time. So again, as a teacher, one of the tools, a free tool that's available to us, is something called eyewitness testimony. So I'm just going to play you 2 short minutes of a testimony from a woman. She was a nurse and she tells her story, and I'm just going to play 2 quick minutes because again, it's very impactful, you know, like Stu demonstrated when you hear the person speaking. And you know, Barbara, that's great. I mean, it's wonderful that you could have survivors in your classroom. That's absolutely, or rescuers or survivors or in your classroom. That's the ultimate, that's the best, but there are also testimonies if you don't have that option. So hopefully the sound, I was having trouble with the sound, but she's speaking in the language in Rwanda. So There are subtitles if the sound doesn't come on.
So Colleen, really quick, we weren't really able to hear the testimony, but we could see the
Oh, you couldn't,
subtitles.
I'm sorry, because the volume was on. I could hear, so I thought just assumed. I'm so sorry. So
That's okay. We have the subtitles, so we can keep
right.
going. That's okay.
But it's nice. It's beautiful to hear the language, though. That adds a nice layer. So I apologize for that.
Well, what we can do is, if you have those links, then we can send them to the participants afterward, and then they can look at that afterwards.
Right. Absolutely. So I apologize for the audio, but I just wanted to ask again, because it was a short testimony, is there anything that you learned about the genocide or something that stuck out with you? And Kimberly, if it's okay, if people want to unmute or just raise their hand because we're a smaller group, and just take a minute or two, I would like to hear your comments about what you may have heard or learned or experienced in listening to that testimony. And I'm really good at wait time.
Absolutely. If anyone would like to unmute themselves and just comment on the woman we just saw, please feel free.
Or put it in the chat if you would rather feel more comfortable.
I think it was hard to, maybe if it was my internet here, but it was, some parts were going quick and then others, you know, the video was going slow. So I missed some of reading some of the subtitles, but those short, teaching history, I think those short clips are so key to, you know, having the students engaged and hearing their testimony. And thankfully in this day and age, we're lucky enough to have digital testimony, whereas in the past we haven't, of these victims and survivors and heroes.
All right, thank you. And then, so Dr. Hilton said there's a connection with last Thursday's when she talked about the presentation in terms of people participating. So again, rescue perpetrators, it's so nuanced, and by looting the bodies, and that's another way of being a perpetrator. So I chose these two clips because you also have to be careful. You have to know your students, and we'll talk about that in a second. But This and what she was talking about, and again, so I'm going to blame David Simon for this because he jinxed us all at the beginning about technology, but so I apologize. But one of the things, she talks about this massacre at a church, and she doesn't really talk about where it was or what happened. But what's nice about if you use eyewitness and get the testimonies from there, on the side you can see they'll give you more information. And then you'll find out that she's talking about the Ntarama Church, and this is the memorial. 5,000 people were murdered. And I will share, like Kimberly said, I will share these links with you. I can't do it right now because I just have to change that eyewitness testimony because that's my account. So I'll just make it more general and give you access, show you where these testimonies are. But this, again, this is a pretty brutal memorial. So again, as a teacher, you want to go through it and look at it and see what you want to share, but it also gives background information, which is, and her whole testimony, which is like almost 2 hours, she talks about living through the earlier, 1990 when the RPF just comes in, and even before that, like in the 60s, because she's an older woman, and so she remembers living through that. She's a Hutu married to a Tutsi, but it doesn't protect her that much because it goes through the husband's line. But also because, and you've heard this in a lot of different ways from everybody, if this is all your students learn, they're not getting the complete story of what happened. And so a way that I start all my classes, all my years with this is The Danger of a Single Story, which is a TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And, she talks about when you're only looking at one aspect, and it's about 30 minutes, maybe a little longer, but it's a really powerful TED Talk. And she's a Nigerian writer, and she talks about her experiences and, the danger of stereotypes, because that story becomes the only story. And so that's something you want to be aware with your students when teaching this subject. And also the USHMM, and this is a link to that. I'm not going to go through all this, but they, and it's really important to have a rationale. Why am I teaching this? Why am I teaching Rwanda? Why am I teaching the Holocaust? Why am I teaching rescue within that? And Stu, you could hear his rationale very clearly came through, and that impacts the lessons, and that's why his lessons are so amazing, because there's a very strong rationale why I want to teach this. And so it's really important to develop that. Why are you doing this? And it's really a why, how, what kind of questions to go through. But it's a great resource if you're not sure, and it gives you some guiding questions, gives you some examples of rationale. And then of course they have their guidelines for teaching Holocaust, but these are adapted for Rwanda. And again, make sure you define the term. So this link will take you to the legal definition of genocide from the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. But that's the legal term, but scholars have expanded that, and there's a lot of talk and debate about what is genocide, what is not genocide. But it's, if you start with that legal definition and kind of, you can go from there if you choose. The other thing with rescue is translate statistics into people, which is always important. And so this takes you to the Genocide Archive of Rwanda, where they've gathered testimonies. But what I love about this is they have the elders, and that will give you a little bit more of the history, and then perpetrators, survivors, and rescuers. So this is a place where you can get some testimonies. So that's just for the teaching part before I get into that. So, and as everybody said, David, and so the idea of rescue is complicated, and it is, so the Yad Vashem has the righteous among nations, and they're very to be identified, and as a rescuer, there are certain criteria, very strict criteria you have to meet, and it's no different in Rwanda. A lot of the countries base it off of Yad Vashem and Intakemwa, which are those who are morally beyond approach. And that is a really high bar to reach. And again, the criteria is saving one or more Tutsi, not receiving any reward, committing no actions, testifying, and not spreading the genocide ideology. And this one, again, is complicated. So they have Ibuka, which was to kind of gather information on rescuers, but they ran out of money, only like 20% of the people. And again, for some of the reasons that David mentioned too, it's tough. And I forgot to set my timer, so I'm not sure if I'm going over time or not. But Rwanda is a patriarchal country. Men are the head of the household. Men, women need permission for any legal things to do, and typically women are less educated. They held fewer positions of power. They are the homemakers. They are the life of the home. They are about community. So what's interesting, and within this small subset of rescuers, known women rescuers are even smaller. I mean, there may be more women, but if they were with a husband, usually the husband would get the credit. So it's kind of hard to say. But the women could use their gender to actually, in their favor, to act as rescuers, especially if they were unmarried and didn't have a husband, because you would not come into a home of a single woman or the elderly. So these are just questions as you're listening to testimonies that you could talk to your students about. But I just want to introduce you. On the handout that I sent, there are more female rescuers, and if you listen to their testimonies, or you can really hear these gender norms come out when they're talking about it. And so you can do a lot of work around that with the students about why they were in a position, why they had the opportunity, or why they went against their husbands, because there are some married women who just were determined to rescue. And this is Sula or Zara Korhimbi, and you have her testimony. I gave you a link to her testimony on the document. She is actually in the Kigali Memorial in their museum, and it's just a very quick synopsis of what she did. But again, she used who she was. She was a widow. She was in her 70s. She came from a family of healers, but she made it known she was a witch. And when the Interahamwe would come to try to get to her house, she would shake her bracelets, she would shake whatever she had, and she would get other people to do it because there's a superstition, and she terrified the people so they wouldn't go near her because she was a witch, and she presented herself as a witch. And but again, she was 72 and she rescued. And it's interesting because I included her obituary. In the museum, it says she rescued 17 people. In her obituary, it gives her credit for over 100. So again, those are things you can talk about with your students, and even her name, that's why I have it in parentheses. This is her name in the museum. This is how they spell her name in the obituary. So, talking about different ideas. And this testimony, so there's a group called proof.org, and that's where this picture came from. And these are rescuers. And if you really want to get into the gendered roles of women, and I gave you a link to her testimony also, she is a fascinating study in standing up to your husband. And, she kind of tricks her husband into letting him think that it's initially his idea, and what she has to go through. She has to get a boat, and she uses her role as the caretaker and the mother of children. She gets her children involved. I mean, they don't know, but just very naturally, and uses all of these things that she has as a woman and as a mother. And so she is a married woman, and her husband a couple times threatened to turn the people in or to turn her in, but she was extremely strong. And but again, her testimony, when you listen to her testimony, it's slightly different than what she says for the proof presentation. So again, that's using testimony, how to use testimony, but her story will really bring home that idea and impact of women. And that's just a quote you see in a lot of memorials, and that idea of community. And if you knew me, you knew yourself, you could have never killed me. And women are in the patriarchal system, we're seen as the community, we're seen as the nurturers. And it's not to say they weren't perpetrators, but again, they use that role to help them. And if part of your rationale is, you know, like Stu said, to teach your students, you know, that they're heroes in waiting. I put this other link too. I would recommend you checking out the Wasmuth Center for Human Rights. This is a poster, you know, you ask when you see something, you choose to make something and choose to make a decision, and then you teach others. So it's just, again, it's just more resources of what you can do with your students. And because again, I think the idea is that if you're teaching about rescue, it's because what you want your students to get out of it and to really embrace the never again and make that more of a reality. And so there are a lot of ways to do that. So thank you. And now I will turn it over to my law partner, David Simon, to close it up. But thank you. I have to stop sharing. Okay.
Okay, I mean, I don't. That was wonderful, Colleen, and Stu as well. Thank you both, and thanks again, Kimberly, for having us. I've got some time to hang out if anyone has questions. I don't want to make anyone else feel like they have to hang out beyond the allotted hour here. But you know, these things I think are best sort of conceptualized as a conversation. We all as teachers have ability to go on, and my apologies if I've done that too much. But I'd love to, and I hope I can speak on behalf of Stu and Colleen to say that you know, we're here to answer questions, whether right now or offline or via email as well. But happy to stick around a bit.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, David.
Oh, yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for the presentations. Really interesting and thought-provoking. I guess my question is for David, and that would be that, you know, based on your presentation, I wanted to see if you thought that the story of Paul Rusesabagina was a prism through which someone could teach and learn about the genocide in Rwanda. I guess I asked that because you mentioned something about, I think it was the film, having a number of scenes that were, you know, strictly linked to, you know, apparently confirmed facts and events that took place. And so I guess that's, you get my question. I mean,
yeah,
so at that point, you think that teachers watching this should feel it's okay to use that film as a prism, you know, being critically aware of whatever limitations you've identified. What do you think?
That's a good question, because you know, the central arc of the story is kind of falsified, but the overall film is really accurate and educational and was intended to be that way. I think so. I guess it's a matter of how comfortable you are with your ability to sort of convey the nuances there. I would not feel great about just putting the film up there and saying, there you have it. There's a hero. There's how you act. But and there are others who would say, no, don't even talk about the film. Pretend the film doesn't exist. It's an anomaly, an abomination. Don't let it anywhere near a classroom. I think that might be a missed opportunity. It is a very accessible film for older high school audiences, and you know, as I mentioned, there are every little scene has some, you know, reflects some you know, part of the story of what happened in Rwanda. And if you're reading anything else in association with that, it can kind of bring it to life. I think the opportunity to sort of say, well, who was Paul Rusesabagina? Why did he do what he did? What are some of the reasons? That would be useful. That could be useful too, especially if you could find sort of a critical article as well, and say, like, here's what someone else says about Rusesabagina. We don't know if that's more true than the movie version, or if the movie version is more of a distortion than reality. But how do we get these two conflicting narratives? I think it's a nice way for advanced audiences. It's a real nice way to sort of think, how do we know what we know? That said, if you want to avoid some of that political morass, there's two other films for high school audiences that I think are upper high school audiences that might work. One is Sometimes in April, came out around the same time, or Sometime in April. Sometimes in April is a Prince song. Sometime in April, which was on HBO, and it tells the story of two brothers, one of whom joined the genocide movement, and another tried to lead the resistance. And it's the non-RPF resistance. I think it's very powerful. It's not as simple a story, and it's a little bit more of a downer than Hotel Rwanda ends up being, but that's probably appropriate too. The other story is called Beyond the Gates. The other movie, rather, is called Beyond the Gates. Shooting Dogs in the British is the British title. It suffers from what I think the film critics call white protagonist syndrome, in that it's a film about Africa with a white events in Africa with a white protagonist. But I do say that the white protagonist does not come out well, at least morally or ethically, in this one. It's about the abandonment of it's essentially UN abandonment of civilians who had sought refuge with the UN, and about how essentially the white world abandoned the Tutsis of Rwanda in this time of need. So if that's also a very heavy and difficult topic, and one which you would want to approach with nuance. But I think it's a film that delivers that message well.
David, if I could just jump in for one quick comment. I think one of the other advantages, if you look at Hotel Rwanda, the film, from 30,000 feet, from a high school student point of view, it gives students an opportunity to begin to surgically look at films and whether or not the historical accuracy is actually there or not. And hopefully it would make them more critical of films that they would then see, so that they wouldn't accept something that came out of Hollywood as necessarily historically accurate. So I think that's another potential advantage to showing any one of these films and using it as a teaching tool.
Okay, we have any other questions from the audience? I will say there was something that caught my attention that Colleen mentioned about how you wouldn't have entered a single woman's home or the home of the elderly. And I think that is an excellent point as to what kinds of rules were still in place and which ones are not during a genocide. I just thought that was an extremely strange, just a strange thing to still be following in a time of so much violence, is that they still wouldn't go into a single woman's home because it would be frowned upon. And I think it brings us back to that question of, what do we see as a moral choice? And so I just personally thought that was a really interesting point. So we will still take questions if anyone has them. But I would like to thank David, Stu, and Colleen for these incredible presentations. Every time we engage in presentations like this, I always learn something new, and so I can't thank you enough for how much work you've put into these. So it really was a pleasure hearing from all of you today, and to see a few questions come in. We would love to see you in our next workshops. We will be meeting again on Thursday at 3 o'clock. We will be discussing Varian Fry, a Holocaust rescuer in Connecticut, with Professor David Pettigrew, who is here with us today of Southern Connecticut State University, and also Allison Norrie, who is a teacher at Ward High School in Fairfield, Connecticut. This, I think, will be a really interesting conversation. So if you do need the registration link again, just let me know and I will send that again to you. I also see that there are a couple of people here who did not receive the document of recommendations, so I will send that out to those who didn't receive it. I will put my email address in the chat box in case anybody needs to ask questions or send us comments about references or recommendations that were mentioned today. So if there isn't any other questions or comments, then we will bring it to a close, and we hope very much that you will join us again. Before you click that leave button, we have one more. I have one more kind of quick poll to send everyone, just to let us know how we're doing. Really, this is the first time that we have done a series of virtual workshops, and so any feedback or questions or comments that you have about what we are doing, you are more than welcome to reach out to us. We would love to hear from you, and we would love to see what it is that we can do that would help you better teach this topic in your classroom. So other than that, thank you all so much, and we hope to see you again on Thursday. If we won't see you again, then good luck this year, and please get in touch for anything that you might need.